Hello, welcome again to this episode of the DHF podcast. I'm a DHF board member and a church planner, and my name is Sam Sears. I'm one of your hosts, and with me is...
Hi, my name is Rick Grace, and I have the honor of serving DHF as the church liaison. So I am the go-between between the 150 or so churches in our network and the 175 pastors that help support those churches. And Sam's good to be with you again. We haven't done this together for a while, buddy.
It is good to have you back. No, we haven't in a while, and we started off and featuring you strong, and then you left me and Scott to do a bunch of the work. But no, I
decided this was a young man's game.
A young man's game? But we love Rick, and always pray for Rick. He's got a hard job pastoring a bunch of pastors, myself included. So if you know me, you know how much work he has to do.
It's like herding cats.
And then we had with us a fellow CIA alum, just like the last podcast guest we had on, and a friend of mine, and he runs the Think Well Ministry, is involved in several ministries. I really appreciate his work over the years. His name is Ryan Pauly. Ryan, could you introduce yourself a little for us?
Yeah, thanks, Sam and Rick. Happy to be here. Yeah, my name is Ryan, president of Think Well organization, trying to train the church to engage these different cultural ideas that we're having to face today. Also the Director of Immersive Experiences at Maven, which is kind of a specialized mission program for high school students, engaging them or training them in theology, apologetics, and worldview, and then immersing them in situations where they have to put that training into practice. And so, excited to be here. I'm have master's in Christian apologetics, working on a doctorate in practical theology right now, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today, which is my first year doctoral research project on a theology of the body.
And I want to give one more plug to Maven. I believe when Brett Kunkel, the founder of Maven, branched off, my Rostro Christi chapter was the first person to have him in for a conference, and those have gone off. The Maven story, True Story conferences are amazing, but really the Maven Family Podcast, an excellent and easy recommend, not just for pastors or elders, but for everybody in your church.
Yeah,
it's a great resource. But yes, we want to talk about theology of the body, a hot topic these days. And so we should just begin at the simple, basic starting point. What's the difference between sex and gender, and how does that play into this transgender movement that we're seeing now?
Yeah, so this is kind of the definitions are really kind of hard to kind of tie down and nail down specifically. You have researchers and scientists that are not Christians and are even on the progressive side that says sex and gender really are virtually the same thing. They're interchangeable words. And that's what we've seen throughout most of human history, is that sex and gender kind of are interchangeable and how they get used, both referring to who you are and kind of who your biological self is, and then how that plays out. Today in our culture, we kind of see the separation in a simple sense being sex is your physical self and gender is your mental state and what you believe about yourself. This can get played out in different ways where maybe your sex is, again, your biological self, but then you have gender roles of how should a man or a woman act, or you have gender norms of what should men and women wear. And so there's kind of gender and what's kind of associated with how you live out the sex, and then that sex is the biological self. And so you can kind of argue in different ways. And sometimes I try to stay away from just arguing about definitions and really trying to say, look, here's how your sex is. And then your sex from a biblical view, as we'll talk about, should then inform your gender. Even if you see that as something different, it should be in alignment and then be informed by how God has created you to be in a biological sense.
I always understood some aspect of the traditional gender roles conversation. I was, during my master's and the very tail end of my bachelor's, I stayed at home with our firstborn, and I was, we called myself the man mom, or, that kind of thing. And I got that was a more traditionally feminine role, but I was still a man the entire time. So what I was doing didn't determine my biology. So I didn't see the way people were taking it further than just a typical, well, these are what most folks do in these roles. Is there a time point that some of this started to kind of shift or change?
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of look at a lot of different time points of when things changed in different ways. I think if you kind of want a resource on this, Carl Trueman wrote the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where he lays out kind of the history of the sexual revolution, really specifically answering a question of how does the statement, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body, how did that kind of become coherent to us? How did that kind of get to this normalized where we just hear that and go, that makes sense? And so he tracks it to individuals like Rousseau back in the 1700s, and how he had certain ideas that really of just kind of the authentic self is what comes from within, is not what is, grounded in something outside of you. You have individuals like Marx and even Charles Darwin then coming and presenting a sociological and a scientific understanding of your body, that you're not created, that you don't have this teleos or this end goal purpose built into you by a creator, but instead you are just this body that's kind of plastic and shapeable, and you can kind of be whoever you want to be. Sigmund Freud then comes along later in the 1900s and presents this idea of like kind of sexualizing it, and then the true authentic self is the desires that you have. And so these are ideas that Trueman lays out, and I think he does a really good job, makes a strong case for it, that began to shape kind of the cultural milieu, just kind of making this plausibility structure and opening up this new idea that now this becomes a possible coherent type sentence to where we hear, I'm a male trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a female trapped in this man's body. And that doesn't just sound different to us instantly. Then we start to see, I think, bigger shifts happening more recently. Obviously, this has been happening before this, but I think a big one was in 2015 with same-sex marriage getting legalized. After that, when that was a big decision, then these other issues kind of started coming along after that. We have examples of, the state of Connecticut changing policy on transgender athletes for high school athletes in 2017. And then we have records starting to be taken in 2018 of biological males competing in female events, both at the high school level. We have obviously Leah Thomas is a popular one now, which I just saw. About 16 female athletes are suing the NCAA now for what happened with the swimming back in 2022. You have Cece Telfer, who's a male runner that won an NCAA Division II national championship in the women's hurdles in 2019. And so you have a lot of these ideas. And then I think that kind of really brought it into the spotlight and really kind of started making this a bigger social issue that people are kind of fighting for. But I want to just say this too, is I remember being at a summer camp in 2019, standing in line at a zip line. I was speaking. It was a Christian summer camp, and a group of girls were in front of me talking, and they were talking about who they were interested in. And this one girl stops and says, well, I only like boys. And the rest of the girls went, oh, it's okay. And so like, here's this idea of like, it's a wrong thing or a bad thing that this girl only likes boys, that she's not either bisexual or lesbian or something different. We went back to that camp a few years later, and it was over 10% of the students there identified as something other than, straight and aligning with your biological self. And so there's many things that we could kind of point to, but I think there's ideas that just started shaping our cultural waters that kind of started normalizing some of these ideas. And then we saw kind of legal action and different laws being pushed that really began to put us in the position where we are today.
It seems to me, Ryan, that one of the things that has happened, especially since maybe the 60s, the whole postmodernism that started as a literary critique in Europe, and the whole shift moved the center of authority from something external to something internal. So we've always had God who helped define our reality, but then all of a sudden the shift happened to where we define reality for ourselves. So it doesn't matter what my gender has to say. What matters is how I feel. So that's my true and authentic self. Is that an accurate representation that we've shifted who gets to say who we really are?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I mean, it goes back before the 60s, right? And that's kind of where Trueman lays out this strong case, where that starts with Rousseau in the 1700s, where Rousseau kind of lays this foundation for this expressive individualism and arguing that the individual's most authentic self is when you act out of your desires and feelings characterized in your psychology, right? And so this is a long time in the making that does kind of start to play out in the postmodern movement, where we move away from kind of what can we know. Modernism is studying scientifically logic and rationality to this idea of who are we to kind of force our views on others. And kind of back to what Sam was saying about gender and sex, what I think really happens is to hold to a theology of the body, that God created you, and then your body then informs you of how you are supposed to live and act and behave, because it's something that is designed and created for a purpose. That then puts me under kind of the authority of who God is and who he has created me to be and how he has created me to be. And so when we remove God from the picture, and we see secularism kind of playing a role in this as well, if there is no God, then there is no creator, then there is no design and purpose for your body. And then also, who's to say that your body should limit you? You see, it's also, with that, what you're talking about of postmodernism is it's this idea of freedom has also changed, where our culture has adopted this idea of freedom. And you ask any student, I taught high school for 12 years, what is freedom? And it's often the answer is being able to do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it. And so if I'm truly going to be free, I can't have any limitations on me whatsoever, including my body limiting me. And so when you kind of throw that idea off that the body is not relevant, it shouldn't be limiting me, therefore what now? Well, my options are endless in a sense. And this kind of can play into issues of sex and gender, because now here's the question. If my body does not determine whether I'm male or female, then what does? When someone says, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body, the question is, well, what does it feel like to be a woman? What is that feeling that you're feeling, or what is it that's causing you to feel that way? And I've talked to a number of students who have come to me and expressed that idea, and the answers that they give are what were formerly seen as sexist gender stereotypes, where girls have told me, I like playing in the mud, or I like chopping down trees, or I like, I walk like a boy, or I like sports. And the question is, well, why can't girls like those things? Right? Or guys will say, well, I'm more emotional, or I stay at home and I cook, or I like do these things. And like, those are previously seen as, sexist gender stereotypes. You're like, women stay at home and men work. But the question is this, if it's not your biology determining your gender, then what does? And I think what our culture has fallen back on, and what queer theory is based on, is these previously known as sexist gender stereotypes that are determining how we live. And so what we see as freedom is actually placing everyone into these blue and pink boxes based on these rigid gender stereotypes that I want to push back against and say, hey, just because you stay at home and cook doesn't make you a woman, and just because you like chopping down trees does not make you a boy. God can create you male and female, and you can act out and live out in different ways.
Yeah, I was a stay-at-home dad, and that did not make me a mom. Dads and moms are still different. And, although we would joke, hey, I'm the man mom or whatever, it was a joke. And now that's been 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't make that joke anymore. The culture has changed and moved forward. But just because there might be some tendencies or some overlap, that doesn't mean you're a whole other gender. It sounds like, Rick, you were getting at something, and both of you were getting at something I wanted to touch on. A lot of the ideas now are almost downstream from other bad ideas that we've had along the way. We're facing consequences of idea upon idea. I had my staff at the last church I was at, I actually watched What is a Woman? And we noticed those same kind of, well, you're pushing against gender roles as the defining moment, and yet you're putting them back in these same boxes. There's some problems there. But even the idea of freedom, I remember I was a juvenile justice officer for a few years, asking what freedom is. And there was this idea of, we'll do whatever I want. And, I pointed out to them, well, then you're just a slave to your desire. That does not involve a conscious choice about what is true. That is just moving forward, trying to feed all your appetites, whatever comes. And we've absorbed some of these bad ideas along the way, and they seem to be playing out now in this transgender ideology. And you mentioned something, Ryan. there's a lot that I could point to, but you mentioned that the number is increasing. Is this a social contagion kind of thing where it's spreading because of ideas that are absorbed and among friendship groups?
Yeah, see, this is, again, it's hard on how we want to classify these different things. I think that it's one thing I've read that makes the most sense to me is this idea of it's kind of is cyclical in a sense of where people have always kind of felt something, right? So there's guys that are more emotional, or there's girls that are more tomboyish, and you were just a tomboy, or you're just an emotional guy. And that was never really a thing. And then all of a sudden we start creating these labels of what that means. And then we start creating different groups and different academic studies to study those different labels and study those different feelings. And then now that we've created these different schools that study them, we now have this language that now explains it. And it kind of then goes in a circle now where more people go, oh, that seems to explain what I'm going through. And so now more people start coming out and identifying based on those sort of explanations that kind of have been created in that circle, if that makes sense. And so I think you do have one where you have, there's numbers of teenage girls specifically is really coming through it at very high numbers, to where people have called this idea of this rapid onset gender dysphoria, where it's like these girls have no record of gender dysphoria, where they've struggled with, their biological sex being different than their gender identity, and there's never been a struggle, and all of a sudden out of nowhere, here it is. And how do we explain that? And I think you can point to some social factors. You can maybe point to the fact that they're going through some difficulties. And again, when we create these super rigid gender stereotypes and say, what box do you fit in? There's a lot of people then that say, well, I don't fit in either box. I don't want to just stay at home and cook, that it's stereotypically, female. And I don't want to, go out to war and fight and do this kind of stuff that's stereotypically male. And so I'm not really male or female. Maybe I'm more non-binary. And so I think it's more we're kind of pushing these ideas, pushing these boxes, pushing these rigid gender stereotypes. And you're now finding a lot of students that are like, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be the dress-wearing, pink-liking girl. And so maybe I'm not a girl. And so again, I think maybe that's more what's going on. It's hard to tell. But there just seems to be a lot of factors to where, yes, there are definitely more people identifying different than what they call cisgender, where your biological self matches your gender identity.
Call me a stubborn old turkey or whatever. When someone calls me cisgender, I inform them that, that puts their worldview on me. Just call me a male. Don't tell me I'm a cis male and I'm just a male. I try to do it politely, but I try to hold firm that line there, because it forces their worldview into the conversation just by the terms. But
it does. It assumes that there is that distinction, that separation, and you just happen to align, rather than saying kind of how we started of, no, there's not really the separation. They should be in agreement. But to help, I used it to help people understand kind of where we're coming from.
I know why you used it. I couldn't help but throw that in there. Yeah. There used to be something called gender dysphoria. And so I've had conversations with individuals, even one young lady who was identifying as a boy and came, and she sat through a whole church service. Her grandpa went, she would skateboard in the parking lot. And, as a pastor, I know that lots of churches put, don't skateboard in the parking lot. Don't do that. Don't do the whatever. I know it'll break stuff. But you know what? I decided that even if it was going to break stuff, I wanted them out in the parking lot. I could see them. I could go talk to them. I could give them water. They, all those kinds of things. And so we built up a relationship there. Then she came in the door. But I told her I did believe she was feeling something. We were just we would address it differently. Yeah. So what's the difference between classic gender dysphoria and what we're seeing now? I mean, it seemed like they were really feeling something. And now sometimes it just seems like they're responding to a group of labels, as you were saying.
Yeah. So that is true, right? So you have individuals, as I mentioned before, that maybe just are responding to labels, or maybe their friends are doing it. There's a lot of different reasons why they may do it. There are individuals that have what is called gender dysphoria, where there's actually this dissonance, this disconnect between how they view themselves and their biological self, to where this is creating angst, depression, anxiety, different things that are actually psychologically going on inside of them. And this is why we have to be careful talking about this issue, to not label everyone is just a social contagion, or everyone is just doing it because their friends are doing it, because I've talked to individuals that truly are suffering through this. I think you can relate it to, I have good friends that are Christians who are same-sex attracted that want to live out a biblical sexual ethic, remain faithful to Christ, but this desire that they have does not just go away automatically. You can also, I think, compare it to anorexia, where the way in which the girl sees herself does not match reality. There is something distorted about how she sees herself, but to assume that she's faking it or lying would be horribly damaging to her. We have to recognize that she does not see herself like we see her, and that there is an actual psychological thing going on along, and then how we come alongside of her. And so we have to recognize that there are individuals like this, where gender dysphoria is a real thing, that through whatever reasons, there is a strong disconnect where they do not like what they see. Or I had an elementary school teacher tell me, look, this is an easy issue. Just look between your legs. And it's like, could you imagine telling that to an anorexic girl of like, this is an easy issue. Look in the mirror. Well, the problem is when she looks in the mirror, she doesn't like what she sees. The problem is when someone sees how they're supposed to be in culture, they don't like that. It's actually creating this issue. And so we have to come alongside those individuals in a loving, caring way. But as I talk to students all the time, think of anorexia, right? Is the loving thing to do. If you have a girl who sees herself as fat, who weighs 80 pounds, is the loving thing to do to say, yes, you are, I support you, and now let me go find a surgeon who will give you liposuction. No, that is not loving, and everyone recognizes that. I think that there is a similarity here with this issue where when a biological male or biological female sees herself in a way that does not match reality, the loving, supporting thing is not to say, you're right, let me help you transition, but to come along inside and recognize that there is a disconnect between the biological self and their psychological self. But the answer is not to fix the biology. The answer is to try to help the psychology line up with the biology.
I'm so glad you mentioned anorexia, because even if the anorexic is to look in the mirror, what they see is distorted by their own perception.
Yeah.
And so even when we provide real evidence, there is a distortion there about whether they can even receive that evidence unless some things are talked through. It's presented in love and maybe some therapy, maybe some issues that are causing that distortion before it ever gets kind of through their own filter.
Yeah.
It's all turning over on the inside. Ryan, my daughter is a mental health therapist. Okay, she's a master's level therapist. And one thing that she has indicated to me is that a few years ago, approximately, she had the figures that she used was about 0.3% of people actually had body dysphoria. I mean, they could clinically identify that. And that has grown over the last 10 years to 30%. And it's those kinds of numbers that make us step back and look and think, okay, this is more than just an explosion of actual gender dysphoria. There's got to be some other issues, whether it's societal or familial or the whole peer pressure or whatever. But I guess one of my questions is, how do we as a church, since a lot of our target audience is pastors and church leaders, how do we wisely minister to someone who comes to us and says, this is my struggle. I feel like God has played a dirty joke on me where my emotions and my biology don't match up. How do we respond to that individual? Yeah. Lovingly, but yet also, as Paul says in Ephesians 4, to speak the truth in love.
Yeah, I think that's so good. Man, and that's hard. We have to respond with questions. We have to respond showing that we care about the person, that we're not just trying to fix an issue. And I think this is the big mistake that sometimes Christians make, is that we act like this is purely a political thing. Yes, there is the political, legal side of it, but then there's the human being standing right in front of you, made in the image of God, deserving of respect, dignity, and love. And so we have to recognize these are two separate issues, what we think politically in this person. At the same time, as you mentioned, we can't change what we see as true. And so, I mean, one of the things that I frequently ask, I've never had an individual get upset by this, is by saying, okay, tell me your story. Why do you feel this way? Can you help me understand what makes you feel like you are a boy? And again, that's when I've gotten these claims, like I like chopping down trees or playing in the mud, or I walk like a boy, or these sort of things that show that what the culture has impressed upon them is that if you act stereotypically masculine, then you're a man. And if you act stereotypically feminine, then you're a female. California Board of Education has it starting in kindergarten. You start to teach gender by teaching what is common for different genders. And so boys like blue and girls like pink, and boys like action figures and girls like dolls. And I mean, this is how it's taught. And so when I've had students who have come to me with true gender dysphoria, I have them tell me their story, have them tell you what it's been like with their parents. Man, I had one girl just break down in front of me with what her mom has said, what her mom has made her do. Her mom made her go to a pastor, where then the pastor just said, here's what God created you to be, thinking here's this authority that's going to speak into your life. And that made things worse. Versus, hearing that, I think, and asking those questions shows that you care about them and you want to hear about their experience and what's going on. And then what you can hopefully then do is to come alongside and support them where there has been inappropriate things, right? Where parents have done wrong, we should be able to say, that is wrong, that shouldn't have happened. At the same time, what I've often presented is saying, look, why do you think these stereotypes that are, again, formerly these sexist gender stereotypes, why do you think these are determining who you are? Why can't girls like this? Or why can't boys like this? And I've often found them, well, I guess they shouldn't. And so, not that the gender dysphoria just goes away, but what I'm trying to help them see is that the cultural way of fixing it says, here's these inappropriate, wrong categories that are, I think, causing this gender dysphoria. I mean, there's breaking down into three different kind of categories. This gender dysphoria is often caused by either one, rigid gender stereotypes, two, not fitting in with your in-group. So if you're a girl and you don't fit in with the girls, you fit in with the guys better, then maybe it's because I'm supposed to be a guy, or not liking what you see in the mirror, not liking how you are. And this is where, again, it's like, most studies show that, like, most individuals, 80% plus, don't like something about themselves when they look in the mirror, right? And so I think I love how Sam Alberry puts it in his book, where he talks about, like, you don't have to love everything that you see, but we're called not to hate what God says is good. And so, like, I think trying to give students just a framework of how, look, we're fallen by sin. There's things about this world that aren't the way we want them to be, but then recognizing how God has created them, the beauty of God's creation, what that might mean for them to come alongside others as well as themselves, how maybe God has gifted them uniquely. Kathy Cook has an amazing testimony where she hated the fact that her voice was so deep, and now as she's grown older, she recognizes she is a public speaker and she doesn't need a microphone because her voice just projects, and she's realizing a lot of these things that she didn't like as a young girl are actually really blessings now as she's older and in public speaking ministry. And so trying to come alongside and by asking good questions, I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help students or individuals see the brokenness or the consequences of the cultural approach to fixing this problem, because they recognize there's a problem that we need to fix. And then I want to try to point them to the beauty and the goodness of a biblical approach to fixing this problem. Both sides recognize there's a problem. Both sides present a different solution. And I often just want to lay both solutions on the table and say, which one do you think is best? Which one makes the most sense? And I often find people seeing the brokenness of the cultural response.
Sometimes I think we as believers, we're far too simplistic in the way we view this. I can give you a chapter, I can give you a verse, you memorize 2 or 3 verses, and all this will be gone in the morning.
Yeah.
Where you started, Ryan, is to come alongside. This is a journey. They didn't, an individual doesn't get to be where they are, whether it's the anorexic or the bulimic or the struggling with the body dysphoria. They didn't get there overnight. And they're not going to get out of that overnight. Are we willing as a Christian community to come alongside someone and walk with them for the long range and not just give the simplistic, you're a sinner, repent, memorize these verses and it'll all be better? Because often it isn't.
Yeah, I've been there with individuals who have prayed for the gay temptations to go away, and they haven't. And that's, I'm not saying that God can't intervene and change things. I'm not saying that, but very often it's a long process of submitting. And it's not something that we want them to have to do alone if we can help it.
Yeah, I did a part of my study and my research is I interviewed high school teachers, Christian high school teachers, or at least high school teachers at Christian schools. And one of the questions I asked was, what verses can you point to that present a positive view of the body, that you can kind of form a theology of the body? And often the only one is Genesis 1:27, God made male and female in his image. And that's kind of where it stops. And so it's no surprise then that Christians are often responding with very simplistic slogans that, while may be true in a sense, only hit one aspect of it. And that was part of my research that I was trying to show is how can we form a view of this from the whole of Scripture? Because often when we just say, well, God made male and female, end of story, we're not taking into account that the world that we live in is fallen, right? If we only look at Genesis 1 and 2, we don't factor in Genesis 3 and what happens there in the rest of the story. If we only look at the fall and the brokenness and not the fact that God is redeeming and restoring all things, then we miss the end of the story. And so the question is, how can we approach this taking into account the entire story of Scripture, creation, fall, redemption, restoration? And often as Christians, to no fault of their own, in a sense, like, we're busy people. We got work and jobs and kids and all these things going on, to then take all this extra time to dive deep into researching a theology of the body and this issue so that we have a comprehensive response is not something that a lot of people have a lot of time for. And so that's why hopefully, things that I produce as well as others can, and this podcast here can at least provide that starting point to start thinking more deeply about this and realizing that often these simplistic slogans sometimes cause more harm than good. And we need to, instead of just responding quickly, sit down with someone in that relationship and just try to understand them. And then through that relationship, hopefully you're doing some reading and studying and whatnot to then respond well.
So what are some resources you would point our audience to? What are some things that we can digest to better prepare ourselves to interact with people who are struggling?
Well, if I can just start off really quickly, I tried to create a resource myself as I wrote my research paper on this and tried to make it a readable resource. It's 15 pages, double-spaced, Theology of the Body Applied to Transgenderism. And so anyone can get that if they head over to my website. I can give you the information on where they can download that paper. I have a link to a whole kind of transgenderism resource that I've created with different interviews I've done and conversations, as well as my paper that can be downloaded. As far as book-wise, there's a few good ones. Nancy Pearcy, Love Thy Body, is a great kind of overall approach on just how we need to called to love our bodies and not kind of harm them or look down upon them. I mentioned Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That's a huge, huge book. He has a shorter version called A Strange New World that is more readable. Sam Alberry has a great resource on this called What God Has to Say About Our Bodies, How the Gospel is Good News for Our Bodies. And then actually two others really quickly, book-wise. Gerald Hiestand and Todd Wilson edited a book called Beauty, Order, Mystery, A Christian Vision of Human Sexuality. Different chapters by different authors, great resource. And then lastly, one of the big ones is Christopher West is a Catholic theologian known as the Theology of the Body guy. And one of the books that I found the most helpful from him was Our Bodies Tell God's Story. Was a very readable, very understandable kind of intro to theology of the body and how our bodies fit into God's story. I think those are all great resources, and I've tried to kind of summarize them all in my paper, which people can get as well.
I love those list of resources. I'd say that for my kids, I've been proactive in kind of addressing some of these things. We read Johnny the Walrus, but we also just have time for questions and those kinds of things. And in the past, to learn the history of how this movement has gone on, I did read a book I really enjoyed called When Harry Became Sally, which is a fun little play. It's been banned from Amazon, but it's around in different places. So I'm interested in how we got here to some extent, but really the most important thing is how to meet somebody where they are. But I just wanted to ask one final question. Is there any traction, any movement, any headway in the detransition stories and the amount of attention that's being brought to the harm on the body? Is this changing the conversation any?
It's interesting how it might be changing the conversation. I think one thing it clearly shows is that this is something that is changeable and changing, and that people are feeling tricked by the cultural narrative. That's what a lot of stories are. It's like, if you go through this process, then your gender dysphoria will go away, and they're finding that it's not happening. Now they're speaking out about that, of like, hey, I felt like I was lied to, I was tricked. Now, what's hard is that I have not found a clear study showing how successful surgery and all that kind of stuff is, because we don't have long-term studies on this. This is such a new thing. And so you have, you read a pro-transgender book, and there's studies that they show to support that this really is helping decrease gender dysphoria. And then you read kind of a book on the other side of the aisle, and it's saying, no, it's not helping at all. And so there's definitely, it's one of those issues where you can look at studies on both sides. But I think the fact that real individuals are saying, look, this happened to me, I went through this, it didn't help, and I'm now transitioning back, I think does show that we need to push the brakes and say, hold on a second, before we keep pushing individuals through. And I think there's a lot of other changes that are happening. I think things like this are leading to, I just heard that in the UK, a big gender clinic just closed down. And so a lot of I think people are realizing that we sped into this very quickly, and that there needs to be some more studies that we're basing our information on. And so I definitely think the stories are at least doing that. I know of someone personally who transitioned and then detransitioned, and then the trans community just said, oh, you were never part of us to begin with. It was all a lie. It was all fake. And so you hear that side of the story. And so it's hard, because you don't really know what's going on truly in someone, but it sure seems that if they're going through all the processes, that they really do believe this about themselves, and then to detransition shows something true is going on there. So I do think they are stories that are powerful, and that we should listen to before we just quickly jump into full support, mode.
I occasionally hear well, why do you Christians care about what other people do to their body? This isn't even a pro-life thing. This is just their body, right? And I automatically think of the stories of people saying that they never, for the sake of the podcast, let me call it the fullness of marital intimacy. They don't experience that anymore, or potentially never. Or puberty blockers that they were promised wouldn't, cause any long-term effects once they got off them. Even if they got off them, their parts never developed beyond childlike parts. And just hearing the tears of people going, there's hair growing inside my body, I'm in pain, this has made it worse. It's not that I want to micromanage someone else's body, but if you love other people, I just don't want to see more people go through this hurt and buy a lie that ends up causing more harm, when they could come to Jesus and have true hope and healing from the inside out. So, and I think we have to be careful how we approach it, because I know, especially when we talk about kids and school systems, we can get angry. We don't want that stuff on our kids, but there's real people hurting, and I just want them to know Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. There is a sense of freedom that we have in our culture to kind of let people do what they want, but then there's also a place where we draw the line. And, and I think, but personally, right, where we draw the line legally is different from where we draw it personally, where there are things that legally my friends can do, but if I love them and care about them, I'm going to try to talk them out of it. I'm going to try to stop them. Maybe it's just eating unhealthy, and you're like, hey, you shouldn't be doing that, or whatever it may be. And so I think that's the whole point. Friend,
right?
Yeah, I think that's the
whole point. Some of the best friends I've had have been able to tell me, hey, look, you're being dumb right now. Don't do that. And I need that from time to time.
Yeah.
Rick laughs. Absolutely. He's been one of them.
Yeah, and I've had enough transgender individuals come to me in tears with gender dysphoria, struggling, that it's like, look, if you truly care, then I don't want to see this happen to others. And I want to help parents come alongside and really love their kids well. And I don't want to see students struggling through this. And so that's because I think that we care and love, which is what our culture wants us to do, is to care and love people. They just see the loving thing as being a very different response.
Oh, and Ryan, that is the key. We would define how we love in a very different way than how our culture would define how we love. Yep. Our cultural definition is, if we love you, we'll support everything that you're doing. No, if we love you, sometimes, as a parent, the most loving thing I could do to my child was to say no.
Yeah.
And
I find it how
you have to be
suspicious
able to-
that our culture's view of love looks a whole lot like apathy.
Yeah, and that's often why I bring up the issue of anorexia. Of if a girl is anorexic and says, "Do you think I'm fat?" What is the loving response? And everyone I've asked, no matter what they believe on the trans issue, will say, "Well, yes, the loving thing is not to say yes, you are." We recognize there is a point, if you really love her, to say, "You're not. Let me help you see yourself in a way that corresponds to reality." And so, yeah, that is the big question of what does it truly look like to love? And that's where maybe there's that deeper conversation of where we point to people to what true love actually is. And as you said, it's not apathy. It's not do whatever you want. True love is coming alongside you and helping you live in a way that matches reality. And I think that's where the freedom conversation comes back. Rather than freedom being able to do whatever I want to do, true freedom is being able to do what you were created to do, right? There's freedom from restrictions, but there's freedom for. What were you made for? And we recognize this. An analogy I always use is think of a train. I ask students, are trains most free on the train tracks or off the tracks? And everyone says on the tracks. I said, but the tracks are restricting it. The tracks limit where the train can go. I want to free the train from the limitations of the tracks, place it on the road. And everyone goes, well, then it's useless. It just sits there and rusts. And the point is exactly, but because the train was created for the tracks become a freeing thing, not just a constraining thing. And to try to free it is actually to destroy it. And if we then are the same way, created by God for a purpose, then the freeing thing is to live out the purpose in which we were created for, to do what God made us to do, and to try to free us from that is actually what is leading to our destruction. And I think that's where the big difference comes in, is I want to, because I love people, I want to help them see themselves as created beings, made for a purpose, made for good things, loved by the Father, and that true freedom is found in Him, in the person of Jesus Christ, where He frees us from the bondage of our sins and our desires and that we're a slave to. And so that is where our culture is going to see things very different, as we talked about from the beginning, where if there is no God, there is no creator, you're not made for a reason. Therefore, the freeing thing is to let you do whatever you want to do. And it looks a lot more apathetic. And that is going to be the huge key difference in our response. But that they do recognize, and what I want to try to pull on is, you want me to love this person, right? Here's how we see love differently.
Wow. Amazingly well said, Ryan. Tell us how we could follow up and learn more about your ministry.
Yeah, thank you. So my website is think-well.org. In fact, the resource I mentioned earlier, if you go to think-well.org/Theology of the Body, all one word, all together, you'll find my resource that I put together there. On YouTube, it's just Ryan Pauly, Pauly, and there you can find interviews and videos and everything I do there. It's a lot more up to date than my website, but that's a little bit of where you can find me. And then with Maven, it is maventruth.com is more information there.
Well, that'll do it. I hope this is an introduction to Ryan, and an introduction, if you weren't familiar with the issue, to some of his work on the theology of the body, or just the concept in general. And we would love for you to follow up more there, but we'd also love for you to follow up more with checking out what we have at discipleheritage.org. We want to help churches and Christian leaders continue to pursue and spread the kingdom of God. All right, hope to catch you on the next one. God bless.